Everyone to the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies lecture series entitled Site of Convergence, Weaving Tapestries of Knowledge. Today, our webinar is entitled Site of Convergence, Tumitindig, Tumitindi, Living and Speaking Through LGBTQ plus Activism in Urban Philippines. And our speaker today is Victoria G. Amos. But before we go on to that, let me first call on Brian Senga, who is the center's SOGI SC coordinator, who will make our welcome remarks and also introduce our speaker. So, Brian.
And thank you, Jasmine. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And of course, happy Pride. Hindi na ako nakapag-prepare ng long speech now, but basically, thank you for attending this event and celebrating Pride with us. Your presence and support for these types of activities would really mean a lot, hindi lang para sa amin, but for a lot of queer Filipinos out there. Siguro side chika lang, personally, no, back in 2016, I became, but I started coming into terms now with my sexuality through these Pride events. No? Kasi doon kasi nag-start yung hope from me na things are changing. Of course, na parang we're now slowly inching towards a queer and feminist future. Ganon. And of course, I also want to thank then Victoria for coordinating with us. No, for those of you who may not know, I actually met Victoria back in 2018. Yeah, estudyante pa ako noon. She came to our organization, UP Babaylan, no, para mag-research. And honestly, yung impression ko lang kay Victoria at that time, parang, oh, another white scholar, no, examining queer Filipino lives. But then binungad ako ng matatalim na Filipino ni Victoria. No? Pinay siya actually. She's also Filipina. And yeah, she knows her stuff. She knows how to navigate the Metro Manila, you know, something I personally can't do. And most of all, no, si Victoria, she's also aware of these power dynamics in place. Talagang lumubog siya sa community. She worked actively with us. Nakimarch siya sa Pride. Tumulong siya sa aming mga Pride activities. Nakipag-inuman, nakipagtambayan. And so I really have a lot of gratitude to Victoria, and I'm really looking forward to what you will share with us. And hopefully, kayong mga attendees then, everyone present in this webinar, I hope you would also look forward to Victoria's presentation. And sana makatulong siya sa inyong mga personal research endeavors. Anyway, I will introduce Victoria there. Okay, so Victoria G. Amos is an Alice Brown Scholar and PhD candidate in social anthropology at the University of Edinburgh, currently being sponsored by the Institute of Philippine Culture at Ateneo de Manila University as a visiting research associate. She received an integrated master's degree from the University of Edinburgh in 2019, submitting her dissertation entitled Many Are Called But Few Are Chosen: Navigating Validity and Authenticity Amongst LGBTQ plus Youth in Urban Philippines. Based on fieldwork conducted amongst members of UP Babaylan's Diliman chapter, the country's longest existing LGBTQ plus student organization, the dissertation ethnographically explores meaning-making amongst young queer people who assert both individual and communal validity through these concepts of language use, activism, and kinship. Her current research builds upon these themes to further examine queer linguistics and identity politics in urban contexts, analyzing the discourses and lived experiences of coming out, being out, and LGBTQ plus pride amongst queer Filipinos across different generations, social, economic backgrounds, and SOGIs. Yeah. So let's all welcome Victoria Amos. Ooh, go Victoria.
Welcome na yun. Thank you din sa UP Center of Women and Gender Studies for hosting me as a speaker today. To UP for Babaylan for participating in my previous research, and of course to the Institute of Philippine Culture for facilitating my current research endeavors by hosting this at year 8. So I'll start sharing my slides now. So let me know if If that works, please.
Ayan, we can see it.
Great. We got over the first hurdle. So a bit of background into how I decided to choose my current area of research. So I was motivated by both academic and personal reasons. So in the anthropology department of the University of Edinburgh, there were a handful of researchers based in Southeast Asian studies. And while they would often explore issues of gender, this would largely pertain to cisgender and heterosexual men and women. And they would barely touch upon queer issues in any depth. And this was reflected in the curriculum that we were taught as students. So of course, you can go beyond the required reading and look up ethnography that addressed these topics in your own time, but the onus was on the students to do this themselves, rather than have this kind of research brought to their attention through the formal curriculum. And personally, I saw that as reflecting this kind of wider reaching idea that Southeast Asian queer issues were still somewhat of a novelty as a topic of research within global gender studies. But there's some really great work being done on South and East Asia in particular. But our space here, in the Southeast is often overlooked despite the immense cultural diversity that we can see across Asia as a whole. And we see these kinds of things across many disciplines. Again, although over the last few decades, we really yielded some really wonderful contemporary academia and academics who are working to fill these gaps, especially here in the Philippines. And I've also had the pleasure of meeting some of them while I've been here. As a queer half Filipino, I also had a personal stake in seeing better representation of these issues. So my mother in particular is a very staunch Catholic, and I went to a Catholic high school where a teacher of mine was notorious for going on homophobic tirades in front of students. So the notion of queer acceptance was far from something I'd grown up with, let alone the notion of queer celebration. When I got older and I was encouraged to think independently about gender and sexuality at university, of course, this was a welcome change, but it also made me look at representations of the Philippines as a gay haven, so to speak, with a much more critical eye. So although foreign media was constantly placing the Philippines in their top 10 gay-friendly holiday destination lists, this is very much at odds with what I knew of the LGBTQ plus Filipino experience as a deeply Catholic post-colony. Not only from gay cousins and friends of mine who were living here, I'm currently in Quezon City, but also from how the rest of our family and how public figures in the Philippines would talk about LGBT people and issues, as well as the rising crimes that were being made public against LGBTQ plus Filipinos. A very famous example being Jennifer Laude and the judicial response to these crimes, or lack thereof, so to speak. So in regards to my previous research, my dissertation research, the first half of this presentation will outline the findings of this research, which, as Brian said, was conducted for my integrated master's dissertation. So this was primarily conducted with then members of UP Babaylan for approximately 2.5 months over the summer of 2018, during which that year's Pride theme for that year was Tumitindig, Tumitindi, which is what I have borrowed for the title of this presentation. The age of the primary participants were ranging between about 18 and 30 years of age at the time. In terms of data collection, I was utilizing semi-structured interviews and participant observation during Pride activities, as Brian mentioned, Tambayan as well, which I have very fond memories of. I didn't necessarily have a definite hypothesis going into this research initially, because I wanted to be open and perceptive to the issues that were being identified by the members themselves, so I could give an honest and accurate representation of their concerns rather than my preconceived notions of what their concerns would be. Although my personal interest did lie in interpersonal dynamics and identity politics, so my interviews consisted of broader questions about personal identity, the history of the organization, and the representation of LGBTQ plus Filipinos that allowed for more open and more personalized responses from each of the people that I interviewed. So in reviewing the data that I collected, three main themes arose that seemed vital to the organization and their goals, all tying back to concepts of being authentic and valid members of the queer community, UP Babaylan, and the Philippines as a whole. So the first theme I wrote about and would like to touch upon is the theme of language. So the phenomenon of gay lingo in particular signified many interesting concepts at play. It is somewhat of an open secret that is very vital to Filipino queer culture, identifies and authenticates users as part of the specific sub-identities, as well as of the LGBTQ plus community at large on a national and even global scale. It's quite hard to define because it's so dynamic, but it often incorporates wordplay, acronymy, other languages. It's also known as gay speak, sword speak, and Betamon. So it authenticates users not only of the larger, the LGBTQ plus community at large, as I mentioned, but it's also dependent on geographical location, socioeconomic class, as well as even in your particular friendship group, for example. In regards to Babaylan, the gay lingo was something, one of the aspects that you would be educated about and then tested, so to speak, if you applied to be part of the organization. So we see a very apparent link here to the idea of authenticating yourself as part of the group through language. But even further than that, we can analyze gay lingo as an inherently creative vocabulary that is in many ways unique, but it also calls upon many common Filipino linguistic patterns. So it follows the incorporation of foreign language. So this is evident in many other forms of Filipino speech. Most are based mainly on Tagalog and other Filipino languages, but we also see influences from Spanish and English and Japanese, as well as many others. So this can be traced to periods of colonialism and imperialism, but also just through processes of modern globalization, migration movements, the internet, for example, etc. Filipino linguistic patterns also include a penchant for colloquial wordplay. So we can see this throughout the history of the Philippines, even during Spanish colonialism, where native Filipinos would often appropriate words in Spanish and make them their own. Nowadays, we see this in linguistic phenomena such as Jejemon and different types of Taglish, as well as gay lingo. There's a wider history of socially marginalized groups, more generally creating their own languages as a way of identifying group members in surreptitious ways, and as well as concealing group members from outside parties. So beyond the Philippines, users of Polari, which is an anti-language that was employed by gay men in 20th century London during the time that homosexuality was outlawed, is an example of this. It employed the slang and cants of criminals, actually. So sailors and convicted criminals. And this was used again to sort of surreptitiously identify other gay men, as well as conceal gay men from, a very heteronormative society where they were being criminalized at the time. But this didn't really stray away from its language of origin in the way that gay linguistics does, for example. In terms of gay linguistics, sort of borrowing from different languages, particularly English, this has been interpreted by some as a dilution of Filipino culture or an acquiescence to foreign power. But to those who are actually speaking and using language. For them, it's imbuing foreign words with specifically Filipino meaning can also be read as a kind of response to colonialism or hegemony more widely. So appropriating the language and ideology associated with the power structures and allowing speakers to subvert or call attention to the inherently constructed nature of the hierarchies that have often placed them on the lower rungs of the sociocultural ladder. So we see this, for example, in English being very much a language of the elite initially in the Philippines after American imperialism. But then this slowly filtered down towards people of lower socioeconomic class, and the use of Taglish evolved in many ways, and there are many strands of Taglish as well. So it's very important to for linguists especially to see who's using these languages, why they're using them, and how they are using them. And in tapping into these same patterns of creativity and appropriation that we see in Filipino linguistics more generally, I posited that gay lingo, as used by Babaylan members, allows them not only to identify one another as LGBTQ+, and reinforce their community boundaries, but also to identify themselves as distinctly Filipino, despite their othering by wider society, or those who might call homosexuality a Western import, which I'll get to a little bit more later as well. So as well as allowing authentication, we can see patterns starting to emerge here, tensions between apparent opposites. So native and foreign, local and global, difference and relatedness. And language is a key way to study how these concepts are not so far removed from each other in lived experiences, especially within a post-colony, and especially when it comes to marginalized groups, with gay language being a prime example, and being a really rich source of examples for this kind of study. The idea of using foreign languages as being a Filipino linguistic trait might seem a bit contradictory, but as I said, it's the way that they are used and why they are used that can make them distinct from their foreign originals, and make them and imbue them with only and imbue them in ways that only someone who has lived in the social and political culture of the Philippines can imbue upon this language, which leads me to my next key theme, which is that of activism. And I put that in a bracket, but I'll explain why that has been done. I thought I was being very clever when I did this. So very early on in my fieldwork, I was told that Babaylan has two primary purposes. The second of which I'll discuss a bit later, but the first is that the organization functions as a human rights advocacy group. So campaigning for equal SOGI rights across the Philippines, so sexual orientation, gender, identity, and expression. One of Babaylan's main endeavors has been to lobby for the SOGI equality bill to be signed into law, although it has remained stuck in the Senate since 2000 at this point. Although you don't have to be formally out to join the organization, the act of participating in activism goes a long way in authenticating members as part of the organization. So putting the act in activism, so to speak. And the idea of resting on one's laurels when you could be putting the work in to fight for rights on behalf of those with less privileges and resources was quite disparaged by members that I spoke to. So like the feeling was that if you can fight, then you should. And by deliberately engaging with public spaces of heightened LGBTQ+ visibility through rallies, protests, pride events, I posited that Babaylan's advocacy work responds to Filipino cultural logics that place significance on identifying with versus acting upon something. So for example, to just explain that in more depth, this was articulated by one member at Don't Ask, Don't Tell during one of our interviews. So this phrase originates from a former US military policy of the same phrasing, which was instituted in 1994, I believe, and then rescinded in 2011, so not that long ago, really. the policy prohibits discriminatory behavior against closeted gay, lesbian, and bisexual applicants. So as long as you haven't said anything about your sexuality, you're allowed to sort of fly under the radar. No one will question you. Don't ask, don't tell. But as soon as you verbally or physically exhibit your sexuality or gender expression, that deviates away from the heteronormativity that the military is so so known for as an institution. That was a perfect basis for you to be immediately discharged. So this framework was utilized by the member that I spoke to while describing Filipino discourses that focus on action over conceptual identity in reference to non-heteronormative genders and sexuality. So for example, another member described an experience at their Catholic high school before he identified as a trans man. And he had asked the priest there whether it was okay to like girls. And the priest said, yeah, it's okay, but as long as you don't act on it. So my interviewee paraphrased this response as saying like, it's okay, just don't do the thing that makes you that. And much of the ideology that has been verbalized in response to the Soji Equality Bill, for example, is predicated on the legal acknowledgement of queer identity that would support people in being openly queer is seen as a threat to the country's historically conservative Catholic values. So for example, Senator Manny Pacquiao, who is well known for his controversial remarks about LGBTQ plus relations, has ultimately said that his problem isn't with gay people themselves, it's with them getting married. So again, it's this idea of identifying as something and then acting upon it. And in another sense, the Soji Bill has also been characterized as a Western import, as I mentioned earlier, that is inherently compatible with the Filipino context. So that's paraphrasing a member of Congress, Eddie Villanueva. So there's once again this two-dimensional conceptualization of Philippine culture as a monolith that could be threatened by so-called foreign influences. So here we see visible queerness being othered from all sides by the mainstream. But by defying this othering and flouting these discriminative cultural norms, activism constitutes an important and rebellious rite of passage, in authenticating oneself as a true member of the Babaylan, for example. So the knowledge of Soji theory, knowledge of the Soji Equality Bill, HIV/AIDS as well, which are core components of LGBTQ plus activism, were also tested as part of the application process. Knowledge of human rights was also a key component. And LGBT rights are human rights is a very important slogan within activist circles, as I'm sure many of you are aware of. Indeed, Babaylan and many other student organizations will identify as human rights activists as much as they do LGBTQ plus activists. And this wider concern with human rights beyond specifically LGBTQ plus issues can be traced by many people to join, as I spoke to many people from different generations, for example, as well. And so discursively, they were tracing this concern with human rights to the joint advocacy work of marginalized groups during and in the wake of the Marcos dictatorship. So all kinds of Filipinos came together to oust a threat that was not only to their immediate community, but to the Philippines as a whole. This, once again became quite relevant during the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte and the war on drugs. And many LGBTQ plus organizations, including Babaylan, champion the idea that the right to fair treatment and protection from discrimination is not only applicable to LGBTQ plus people, but to all Filipinos, which they share social, cultural, and ethnic roots with, no matter their Soji. So once again, they're asserting themselves here as not only LGBTQ plus and a marginalized group, as Filipinos who the national law should protect alongside the rest of the population. Many people assert how important it was for this kind of work to be done in the Philippines specifically, to address and contest conservative religious norms that still dictate much of Filipino society and politics, using the globalized rhetorics of SOGI and human rights. So studies of LGBTQ plus people in the global South will often report aspirations to move elsewhere. So for example, somewhere that is more accepting or has more robust anti-discrimination laws in place. But many members I spoke to were adamant that they would remain in the Philippines, or they would at the very least return after work or education, for example, because it is very much their home as much as every other Filipinos. We've seen similar conversations, for example, happening in the present day, where people with a financial means are wondering whether they should leave the Philippines in the wake of Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s election as president, as well as the response that they've also faced from people because of that opinion. So you see a lot of this stuff on Twitter, for example, and like the response would be, walang mag-aalis, makikita lang tayo sa kalsada. So there's a responsibility to fight for the future of your country rather than fleeing from it and leaving those, with less power and privilege behind, although there is, of course, many differing opinions on that topic, which leads me to my third key theme, which is that of community. So it might be easy to lose sight of the many subcategories under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, as they're often made out to be monolith in the eyes of the heteronormative mainstream, or in contrast, completely separate cliques based on SOGI with nothing else in common. But here we see again these tensions between the concepts of difference and relatedness, with which we can complicate by studying LGBTQ plus communities. So in this particular chapter, I was employing the concept of archipelagic subjectivity, which is coined by an anthropologist named Tom Bolstorff, which is a conceptual and visual metaphor of an archipelago, which is very relevant to the Philippines, to examine how LGBTQ plus individuals and communities can exist as separate islands of difference, yet they come together to form a very vibrant, the vibrant LGBTQ plus population of the Philippines as we know it today. And this visual metaphor acknowledges the intersectional, multitudinous nature of LGBTQ plus people, who will often come together and support causes that affect the community as a whole, but also accounts for the conflicts of interest or the different priorities between different particular sexuality and gender categories, those with varying political affiliations, for example, again back to socioeconomic class as well. A frequent example here that was brought up during interviews was the politician Geraldine Roman, who members would acknowledge as an important public figure, as an openly trans politician, but whose support of the death penalty was disparaged because this goes against the cause of equal human rights for all. And the critique that she also only represented a moneyed subsection of Filipino LGBTQ plus people that were afforded certain privileges that were unattainable to normal people. So as one of these many islands of difference, Babaylan has its own internal logics of community, although the focus on authenticating oneself as a valid part of the organization in various ways is a key component of how the organization operates. Your personal SOGI would not be questioned, and your status as part of that particular community would be a given, as long as you had proved yourself in that sphere of activism. So here I return to the second primary purpose of the organization that I mentioned earlier, which was verbalized to me as a support group. So members are regularly facing social, political, and economic discrimination on the basis of their SOGIs, and these often go beyond the boundaries of conventional friendship, where a line is drawn between blood relations and non-blood relations. So most interviewees would equate their emotional bonds to other members as equal to or even exceeding those that they shared with their biological family. And here, this really destabilizes Euro-American notions of family as exclusively based on genealogical ties. LGBTQs would often demarcate their chosen Babaylan families as, even more real than their biological ones, because of the proven nature of these cultivated relations through care and support. The support would manifest not only through extensive emotional care. So for example, accepting and validating their members' societies by using their chosen names and pronouns without question, supporting their being in peer relationships in contrast to being invalidated or reprimanded by their families or by wider society, or even by other people at the university. So for example, one member spoke about a professor of theirs that refused to use their chosen name because it wasn't on their school ID. But aside from this, there's also physically providing members with places to stay. They had to leave their family home, for example. So these kind of processual and active nature, this processual and active nature of kinship and community sort of indicates these things as something that you work for and you act upon rather than something that inherently exists through blood relation, for example. And this relates back to one's authenticity as an activist as well, something that has to be cultivated through action and putting the work in rather than simply being a member of the organization in name only. And although active advocacy work for the organization often takes place specifically in the public sphere and is deliberately designed to be visible, building community bonds also occurs through intimate everyday actions in ordinary settings. And I'll return to this idea a little bit more in the second half of my presentation. So to conclude all that, the three main themes of language, activism, and community that arose these were ones that were vital to the organization and their goals. Again, all tying back to ideas and concepts of validity and authenticity that are so important to cultivating a sense of individual and group identity, especially important to a group as marginalized and invalidated as LGBTQ+ people. These findings often bridge the gap between the so-called foreign and native distinction, or the difference and relatedness distinction as well, that has previously been relied upon in the studies of queer communities in the global south. So returning to the scholar Tom Bolsdorf, which is a Dutch name, but I don't know that I'm saying correctly, in situating LGBTQ+ subjectivities in Indonesia, he critiques two main tropes of contemporary literature, analyzing queer communities. The first he calls the gay planet, which refers to gay and lesbian movements structured by similitude, which are assumed to be globalizing and positively affected by globalization. Whereas the second is one he refers to as McGay, so like McDonald's, but McGay. This indicates traditional and indigenous culture structured by difference and assumed to be localizing and negatively affected by globalization. But all these steadfast binaries that we're often using often fail to take into account personal agency and the process by which these concepts are taken up and mediated in different contexts. So with this in mind, the active engagement with language activism and community building allows members of the organization to authenticate themselves as both queer and Filipino, despite the binarization of these two identities in religious and political rhetoric. So through their everyday interactions and discourses, as well as their more formal and public ones, as well as their specific stance on LGBT activism through human rights. Oh, sorry, I won't speak a bit louder. Where was I? So through these discourses and interactions and engaging with the three themes that I have outlined in my dissertation, members are constantly redefining both queer and Filipino identity to render the two mutually inclusive. So they acknowledge their othering from Filipino cultural norms, but refute these logics in active and visible ways, which in turn validates their membership as part of UP Babaylan as well. Indeed, the title of the dissertation, so many are called but few are chosen, the reference is biblical scripture, which is Matthew 22:14. I once heard being used in jest, between Babaylan members when someone was complaining that they hadn't been included in a group activity because they hadn't been active in the group chat when it was organized. And I think it very neatly, kind of sums up. I'm linking this quote to the work of meaning making that analyzed throughout the dissertation. So it's a pithy summary, that all are welcome to join the cause of human rights and LGBTQ+ activism, and by extension, the Babaylan family, but only a few will put in the work to prove themselves up to the task. So as an academic, I'm often critical of work I've done yesterday, let alone 4 years ago at this point. So in hindsight, I've identified some key issues with my previous research. Firstly, that I was only allocated a few months over the summer of 2018 to do the fieldwork, so I wasn't really able to immerse myself in various different field sites and observe how these compared, for example. So my analysis wasn't really able to address in detail certain intersections of lived experience. So namely the significance of the university as an academic space in how people spoke and how people acted, and relatedly class distinctions as well when it came to identity conceptualization and expression. Secondly, the scope of the project as an analysis of queer identity was rather large, and I attempted to cover a lot of ground considering the time and resources I had as a master's student, which led to some kind of muddled analysis when it came to summarizing the project's key themes, which I hope I talked my way out of during this presentation. But these assessments in turn, partly became a jumping off point for my current research, which I now turn to. So in terms of next steps, I approached the project through a lens that was more specifically centered around language. And my main research questions were, once again, so my initial research questions were more so to do with LGBT youth again. And they questioned, what kind of socio-historical particularities of, Filipino as a national language and an identity shape urban LGBTQ+ identifications and vernaculars, such as gay lingo. This also took on a religious aspect as well. So, how do the discourses around and experiences of religion, particularly Catholicism, what does that look like amongst these queer activists? And lastly, how do LGBTQ+ youth engage with the dialogues and movements of rights equality, and the specific ways that is engaged with? So currently I'm in the 3rd month of my research, and I've made connections with a variety of LGBTQ+ organizations and individuals across Metro Manila, including those beyond the university space. And the less explicitly political communities have actually started to yield some interesting data that has caused my research interests to pivot somewhat. So speaking to these groups has pushed me, to interrogate how useful or how accessible the mainstream kind of discourse of LGBT activism is to those outside of the university space. So particularly that of, rights equality, LGBTQ+ pride, and what it means to live as an LGBTQ+ person who doesn't have access to this vocabulary and these resources that allow activists to become fluent in human rights and SOGI rhetoric. Is it the most effective way to talk about and make visible LGBTQ+ issues in the Philippines as a whole? For example, the terminology surrounding this is mostly in English. So Taglish is a common phenomenon for sure. The degrees to which fluent English, is used varies geographically and across socioeconomic class. reflecting back on previous interviews, Babaylan members would more so often use English and follow the SOGI acronym when asked how they identify, for example. So, for example, I'm a bisexual transgender woman, or I'm a gay cisgender man. And here, we see the SOGI acronym. It's clearly a very useful tool in verbalizing and validating your identity. It's also language that's, judicially recognized across the globe, but a lot of those who identify, more colloquially, so as bakla, which is no, exact English translation really, as Martin Manalansan and other queer Filipino scholars point out, what about colloquial variants such as aswag, paminta, parlavista, I'm also concerned with what LGBT activism looks like beyond the space of university. So many many members that I interviewed previously kind of spoke of their educational and their social and their work life all converging on campus, which is very conducive to kind of eating, sleeping, and breathing your organizational activities as part of an org. But how does that look? How do those with full-time jobs perform activism when they can't take time off to go to rallies or go to protests, or they can't risk being as visible as that? What does their activism look like? How much do they prioritize it in their daily lives? And returning to the concept of LGBTQ plus pride and being out beyond safe spaces. So for example, university campuses with anti-discrimination ordinances, cities with anti-discrimination ordinances, since it's not a national law yet. What does this look like if you're strategically keeping quiet about your status as an LGBTQ plus person at work or at home, when you have to keep private accounts or very carefully curate your online persona because most of your family follows you on Facebook, for example. How people express their political meanings and moral codes in a more intimate and everyday fashion. So drawing here from Jan Cornelio and his research about engaging more so with your immediate community rather than organized efforts towards charity and activism that we will often see on university campuses, for example. In terms of methodology, for my theoretical framework for this project, I'm very interested in centering emerging conversations in queer and colonial theory, and a key aspect of this is collaboration. This centers research participants as active interlocutors in the research process, as well as acknowledging that they're unique individuals whose well-being needs to be accounted for as well. So dialogic methodologies that enable lines of empathetic communication and shared vulnerability between the sort of historically dichotomized researcher and researched, and destabilizing the value of the supposedly detached and omniscient academic. Indeed, as a method, ethnographic research is particularly valuable in bringing queer theory to practical fruition because it's centered around emotional intimacy and open dialogue between the researcher and the research participants. As I mentioned previously, its immersive nature, allows research into language use that goes beyond a one-dimensional sense. So, for example, we're not collecting terms to put in a dictionary. Where I'm trying to explore how language is essentially lived through in the everyday context and what its use means to the people who use it. One of the most obvious ways that people communicate within and out with their social groups is language, but dialogic methodologies and discourse analysis and all this doesn't really take a front seat when it comes to the most social sciences in terms of contemporary scholarship. Again, they're comprehensive approaches that center the aspirations and ideals of the research participants and presents them as fully rounded people in their own right. In terms of my own positionality, I fully acknowledge that I'm queer and I'm half Filipino. I can't I don't wish to speak on behalf of marginalized groups with lived experiences and discursive histories that are very different than mine. And again, I don't want to be that one white researcher. I would really, my goal here is really to partner with LGBTQ plus Filipinos to conduct research that not only benefits me as a researcher, but them as marginalized individuals and communities. And this is something that we very much negotiated from the beginning of any potential collaboration. I'd also like to potentially experiment with multimedia and secondary data development. So for example, using social media posts or song lyrics or spoken word or sermons, how language can be used and studied in creative ways beyond the standard question and answer interview. A big goal of mine would be to eventually translate my dissertation, my PhD dissertation from this project into different Filipino languages with the help of translators, for example. And accessibility of this project beyond the academic manuscript in general is actually quite important to me. It helps that ethnographic writing is quite genre blurring in that it weaves like detailed description with analysis. And again, in terms of positionality, once more, I'm by no means a totally unbiased party when it comes to issues I'm researching, but neither are the research participants, because we have skin in the game, so to speak. It makes us, makes it even more important for us to produce work that can be useful to LGBTQ plus Filipinos, that can be presented to experts and laymen alike through, multiple different formats. All that is to say, I think above all, I think it's just important to gauge how queer people are, rebelling against, or even just simply trying to move through the current climate of political uncertainty in the aftermath of the Duterte's administration, as well as in these early days of Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s presidency. As important as it is for marginalized groups to band together and present a united front, in these situations, do the priorities of different LGBTQ plus communities align? And are they even using the same kinds of language to express their concerns? And if not, how do we ensure that everyone's voice is heard? To conclude, I really hope that this research that I'm currently conducting for this project can help answer some of these questions and indeed, contribute a thread to the tapestries of knowledge that are being woven by institutions like the UP Center for Women and Gender Studies. Thanks once again for hosting me. Thank you to the webinar attendees for listening, and happy Pride, everyone.
Thank you so much, Victoria. So it's really so interesting to learn about UP Babaylan and how their LGBT activism is like, and it's interesting to learn about how their queer identity interacts with their Filipino identity, and then about gay lingo and how that interacts with their activism, and also that they're a support group. And that's so important to give individuals like a community that is supportive and validating, etc. And it's also interesting to learn about your future plans. I got specifically interested in, you said spoken word and social media. So and also bringing it out of academia, because academia is such a limited world, so we need to influence more parts of the world. So I think that's really an exciting project. So for the people in our webinar, please add your questions in our Q&A function. We have a Q&A function here in our webinar. In the Q&A function, there's also an option to be anonymous. So if you're shy, you can don't worry. You can be anonymous, and we'll be the one to read your questions. So while waiting for people to put in their questions. I can ask a few questions for Victoria. So I was reading a little bit in terms of your dissertation. And then there's a part that you talked about how there's a tendency for LGBT individuals to kind of tend to assimilate towards global identities. But then there's also that the encouragement. You said that you advocate for a nativist kind of identity or something like that. So do you remember the first time you encountered that idea, and how has your understanding of that idea kind of developed over time?
Parang super mundane siya ba? Because I think I have a lot of queer friends back in the UK as well. And I think at one point, one of my friends was following a queer Filipino person on Twitter. And she was saying, oh, I was really surprised that I could understand most of her tweets for Pride, even though it was, supposed to be, I assumed that she would just be, because they followed her for like her fan art, for example, so she wasn't necessarily keeping track of like her written tweets. But then when she started tweeting stuff for Pride, she noticed that a lot of what the content creator was tweeting was in half English and half Tagalog, and she sort of mentioned that to me in passing, and as not only like a baby gay, but also as a baby researcher at the time, I really thought there was something there, and especially, and I guess it also comes from certain personal experiences of mine as well, in that I definitely would say that I speak Taglish more so than straight Tagalog. But when it comes to activism, that barrier has not been up so much, because again, a lot of the rhetoric that is used is in English, and that benefits me as like a native English speaker. But what about people who don't speak English fluently, or they don't use English at all? And it got me thinking about who we're excluding by centering discourse that's so based in one language. And again, as all things do, everything goes back to colonialism. In the end, all roads lead to colonialism. And I wasn't really able to, I guess, go into so much detail in the presentation because I was very aware of time. But they're tracing, the history of, for example, even human rights discourse. A lot of that stems from the UN and their official documents, and and again, that's I've read a lot of articles that have interrogated that, basically trying to find out whether sort of copying and pasting these laws and these addendums to contexts outside of Euro-America, does that work? Is that useful? And of course, academics have a lot to say about everything, of course. And the answer is maybe, apparently, because on one hand, yes, it is useful because it's at least giving people a framework to then use as a jumping off point, for example. And again, it is very sort of globally recognized as a judicial language. But then again, some of these, what happens to sort of marginalized categories of people that don't fit in with that, with those very specific English terms, for example. But then of course, there's people in the middle who say, there's cultural exchange that goes both ways. It's never just, even in colonialism, as much as, that was a total, abuse of power and exploitation of the various peoples across the archipelago at the time. It was never a passive action on the behalf of, on the part of the Filipino people. They, as I mentioned, kind of appropriated language, they appropriated ideology, and it was never an exact copy and paste of what was being forced upon them. They always made it their own and nativized it, so to speak. So it was more so a culmination of all these things that were kind of hanging out in the back of my head. And then I guess having an outside party, an English-speaking friend of mine just say it directly to me, I was like, that's a good point.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. So we have our first question from an attendee. What do you think of Filipinos using AAVE language on our own gay lingo? Is it cultural appropriation or not?
So this is, again, as an anthropologist, I will not be able to give a yes/no answer. I'm so sorry. It is actually something that I wrote about very fleetingly in my research proposal for this current project, because
is it okay for you to also define AAVE language for those who are not familiar, like me? I'm not super familiar with that.
Yes. Oh, yes, sure. So AAV, I believe, is African American Vernacular English. So it's a slang. Well, people have defined it as a slang way of speaking in English that's quite American in origin. But again, as a linguistic anthropologist, I've looked into this myself, and there's actually a lot of research from Black scholars that actually sort of proves that the specific patterns that are being used in African American vernacular English actually makes it eligible to be its own language. And that because you have to know specific patterns and you have to know rules. In a way, it's the same with languages in the Philippines, for example. There was a lot of confusion about, when the Americans coming over, they would incorrectly categorize languages as dialects, and all that kind of stuff, because they never bothered to look into it too deeply. And I think for a long time that was, very much a white response to AAVE. It was just it was considered an incorrect way of speaking, or a way of speaking that kind of denoted your socioeconomic class as being more so on the lower side. But with that said, answering the actual question, it's really interesting in that white gay Americans have really co-opted AAVE as part of their own gay lingo over in the US. And we've seen that kind of become a global phenomenon as well. So for example, yes, it's being used as part of Filipino gay lingo as well. And it's very much become a part of drag culture as well. So for example, with the popularity of, RuPaul's Drag Race, this kind of language is kind of being all across the world. And in a way, we're finding affinity with our gay brothers and sisters and these across the globe, which arguably could be a good thing. But then again, we ourselves, when that is being, so when we're exposed to that culture and we're absorbing that and we're using it, it's not being broadcast to us with the history of AAVE and the history of white gay males appropriating the speech patterns of Black or Latinx trans women, which is where most of the popular kind of gay American lingo comes from. Particularly within the ball scene is where that became really popular. Is it cultural appropriation? Is it cultural appropriation if you don't mean it to be? It's a question, because again, the internet often likes to abbreviate things. Like we're not getting nuanced, we're not having nuanced conversations about this, or when people are exchanging language or information like this, especially when it comes to popular culture or entertainment, we're not really ever getting the full story. So is it cultural appropriation if you don't necessarily, if you are never made aware of the fact that it has very, important significance for African American communities? I don't want to call anyone out particularly at all, because I'm certainly guilty of using it myself, and I'm trying to make a conscious effort not to do so. But I think these things often become like so woven into the cloth of gay culture that spreads across the world. Again, but we're not, in a sense, sometimes it's often not our fault, because we're not being given a disclaimer that this is where it comes from. But then the other argument is, should we be looking these things up ourselves? I don't. It's food for thought.
Yes, yes.
But such an interesting question. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, very interesting question. Thank you for the one who sent in that question. So please continue to send in your questions. Right now, we're still waiting for another brave person to send a question. Again, you can send an anonymous question, unless Brian, are you gonna ask a question? That's why you're turning on your video.
Nagustuhan ko lang yung sagot ni Victoria dun sa second question. But anyway, sige. I wanted to ask this earlier, medyo in relation to what Ja asked then. Because you mentioned about this agency to fluidly navigate yung binary of similitude and difference in terms of language. What I wanted to ask is, were you able to also gather information on how like external factors, for example, or historical events, political changes, have conditioned or shaped this agency? Like when do they usually assert their indigenous language and culture, or when do they uphold these global or sometimes Western frameworks and language?
Thank you. Again, it's hard to say because there's so many different shades, and it does depend as well on where you are in the country. I think as well, like for example, like Anita Tayo sa Metro Manila, which is essentially the hub of colonial activity, for example, when the Spanish came over and also when the Americans were here. In a way, I think it's Babaylan is an interesting example, again, actually, because like, for example, again, we're using very global rhetoric of human rights rhetoric, Soji discourse, again, even the ideas of like pride are global phenomena now, and whether they are taking on new meaning when they land in a different context, versus kind of just being almost like a co-option of Western ideals of what it means to be gay or lesbian, or bisexual, non-binary, trans. I think there are two things that can't be so easily separated, I guess, but on one hand, you have that aspect of sort of Babaylan's advocacy, right? But then on the other hand, you have, you know, the Babaylan as your namesake. And it's under that banner. And that's the first thing that people will hear when you know, introduce yourselves. And I think that's, you know, reaching back again into the pre-colonial past. And, you know, even conversations that I had with members previously about, I mean, like, you guys are all very, I think, very aware that, you know, things are never black and white when it comes to these issues, because as much as the Philippines, you know, pre-Spanish colonialism was, it appears to have been much more free and much more flexible in terms of gender identification and, you know, acceptable sexuality. But, you know, I've also had conversations with people who are like, you know, we're not necessarily putting indigenous Filipinos on like a pedestal, because of course they had their own issues. You know, there were their own different power dynamics going on at the time as well. But at least their ideologies are much more fluid. It seems to be, rather than rigid. Which very much is like a European ideal, is to be easily categorized for ease of, I guess, especially with the Enlightenment and everything, and that kind of scientific digging at something and wanting to understand it, but then making it like a very sanitized version of itself in the end. And I think, again, being aware of these histories is really important. So, and that comes back to the idea of agency, because how can you have agency if you don't know the full story? A lot of the time, it takes a lot of agency away from you to make your own decisions about the information that you are handed, or the information that you are are absorbing. So I think education about these issues is really important, and completely has links to agency. And, you know, it's work as much as, you know, no advocacy kind of framework is perfect, of course, because we're never going to be able to address every single person in a marginalized group, for example, with that rhetoric. But I think at the very least, like, again, Soji rhetoric and the idea of pride is obviously not without flaws, but it's still very important in terms of visibility, and at least it's out there. It's putting LGBTQ plus people out there in the public eye. And it's less, and visibility is never a bad thing when it comes to marginalized groups. And then again, hopefully with that visibility, you can get more people interested to learn about these things in their own time. But it definitely starts with education and accessibility of education.
Thank you, Victoria.
Yun. Okay, so may isa pang nagtanong, what are your opinions about the difference in the reception of the whole Philippine-X thing of Filipinos here versus those based in the US?
Yeah, yeah, I've had a lot of, this is the trouble, I think, being an academic on Twitter, because everyone's opinions are kind of flying at you all the time. And a lot of the time, especially like, there's just, you know, I appreciate academic Twitter as a space, because at least people are bothering to have like more nuanced conversations. And at least there's threads maybe and that kind of thing. But when it comes to sort of Twitter more generally, or social media more generally, there's much less time and room to think about things. I think you have to, it encourages you to have a very like snap decision about what you're being faced with on the screen, which is not very good for like critical thinking. And this, the Filipino X situation is kind of one that I found out like through those kinds of arguments, because on one hand you had people who were very much for it, who were very receptive to the idea of having a so-called, you know, genderless identifier as a Filipino X individual. But then at the same time, you have also people coming back with, well, the only reason really that Filipino and Filipina became a thing essentially was because that was adopted through Spanish language patterns that we then took on eventually. So for all intents and purposes, Filipino is technically gender neutral if you really go back to the origins of the word. But again, no one on Twitter has time for like etymology, etymological history, which fair enough, it's, you know, it's very niche. It's hard, it's a hard thing to speak, it's almost a hard thing to speak generally about, because it's such a personal thing for people to identify with, because especially in the diaspora, I think, because especially, for example, if you're a Filipino person who's grown up in the US, there's a lot of influences over there, and there's a lot of cultural specificities that you might not obviously be privy to if you were, you know, living in the Philippines. And I can, you know, certainly relate to that because I wasn't born here. I visited many times. My Tagalog is passable, but apparently not for not for public speaking, because I get very self-conscious about it. But even that, you know, it's the technical language part of me champions this idea that Filipino, as you know, word is already inherently genderless. And even in the Filipino language, you know, with siya, etc., those are technically genderless as well. And it feels like having to put that X on the end is almost, I can understand people who are saying, again, that's the influence of the whole Latinx conversation, which again is like very US based, and comes from like a very US sort of cultural norm of, again, having there's a box and you need to tick it. And you know, for some people that helps, and I definitely won't invalidate that at all. And I can understand why Filipinx would be like something that you would relate to, especially if you weren't so aware, for example, of like the linguistic history of like Tagalog as a language, for example. Because again, like standardized Tagalog is, you know, a whole different thing in itself as well. For me, it seems like this is very like informal, and like I haven't done a survey or anything, but it definitely seems that Filipino diaspora in the US seem to latch onto Filipinx a little bit more so than, for example, people in the Philippines would. And I don't know whether that's because, again, there are very specific cultural differences in the way that identity politics is handled here, especially like in the public domain. It's only very recently that LGBTQ plus issues here, because there's always been people fighting for them, but the majority of the country still is very Catholic, very conservative. And again, there's this idea that like, oh, you know, I'm fine with gay people as long as they're not, you know, in my face about it, or in my neighborhood, or like living next door to me, which is again, obviously something that you can experience very much so in the US, depending on where you are, but they don't have, you know, that same colonial history that we do, in the sense that Americans like to think, like to conveniently forget about there being a colony. Whereas our history in that same way is like very much framed as part of our history as a country. Whereas again, the US likes to conveniently forget about it a lot, and they don't really teach their kids about it. Whereas like it's very obvious here, I think, like there's a lot of Spanish instructors here. You know, the US.
Oh no. So nag-freeze si Victoria. Okay. So we'll just wait for her as she works out her technical issues. But yun, Brian, do you have any comments so far about what Victoria has been saying?
I actually really like her answer. Sige, in relation to that question and to what Victoria was also saying. And nakabalik na ba siya?
Ayan, nakabalik na yata siya. Okay, we were just stalling. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Wait, you're muted. Ayun.
Like, well, that was sabotaged by my internet.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. We're almost at the end anyway. Oh, go ahead. Where were you?
Oh yeah, I was just saying that I think everyone has it's part of, you know, our advocacy, that everyone should be able to identify the way that they want to identify. If it feels right for you, it feels right for you. Just don't try and force your, like, whatever it is, like, even if you think, as soon as you take the moral high ground, I think having like a civil conversation about something becomes totally impossible. So I think it's, you know, even it's really hard to say, especially when it's people who are sort of yelling at you online. And it's really hard to say, just like, you know, turn the other cheek, etc. But at least the possibility of having a constructive conversation is more possible if you try and approach the other person on a human level.
Nawala naman siya. Anyway, buti na lang sa dulo na lang yung nagkaroon tayo ng technical issues. Pero yun.
Pero yun nga, I think yung sinasabi ni Victoria, it's very similar to what Prof. Tuting Hernandez also said about this whole debate sa Philippine X, ganyan, no? And siguro in a nutshell, yung response ni Prof. Tuting was, parang we sort of create or construct our identities based on the language that's available to us and the cultural fields we are navigating. So, of course, for us Filipinos, nag-resonate sa atin yung pagiging gender neutral ng Filipino. Although, pinoint out din naman ni Prof. Tuting na differently gendered ang language sa Philippines. No? Although may Filipino, meron din namang Filipina, that also indicates how it's still in a way gendered. No? But of course, as mentioned din by Victoria kanina, we can't really take it against the diasporic experience na mas nag-resonate talaga yung Philippine X, kung saan nag-influence yung Latinx discourse. No? Kasi iba rin naman yung cultural fields, iba rin yung nasa-symbolize ng language that they use. No? So, ayun, And yung maganda rin yung pinout out ni Victoria na we should be careful not to invalidate. No, we can take it against these people when they are asserting their spaces in their own language. No? So maganda nga as mentioned ni Victoria na at least we should have this very constructive conversations with each other. Hindi yung nanggagaling tayo from a moral high ground. No?
Yeah, no, parang respect the diversity of constructing identities. Kasi kahit na Pilipino tayo lahat, iba-iba pa rin yung Pilipino na lumaki nga sa US, Pilipino na lumaki dito, iba-iba din yung cultural context na, and yung sabi mo nga, they're responding to the cultural context and the cultural situation that they are in. Ayun. So, hinihintay pa rin natin. Sige, Victoria. Pero meron na ba, may last question pa ba? Ilagay niyo na sa Q&A.
Meron nag-message.
May nag-message sa'yo.
Maybe we can also ask Victoria this question later. Should we evolve local terms for SOGIES? Ang hirap.
Gumawa ng local terms
local term. I think may mga efforts actually, to localize these frameworks, like for gender identity. I think narinig ko na yung term na piling kasarian, ganyan, no? But ang hirap kasi not just translations. Okay. Yeah. Currently, yung mga efforts ng advocates right now, hindi necessarily to like translate yung SOGIES, although may mga attempts, no? Pero mahirap talaga, hindi nag-work yung direct translation. So. Pero may pagpapalitaw, pag-surface ng mga local terminologies. Like, yung mga nabanggit ni Victoria, like yung bakla, yung Filipino connotations of tomboy, no? Kasi they also reflect yung expressions natin of our identities, no? And mahirap lang siya for others kasi for such a long time, these terminologies ay weaponized by people in positions of power. Sila yung nagde-define ng language, no? Pero activists, and not just activists actually, a lot of LGBTQ Filipinos are slowly reclaiming itong mga terms na ito, trying to study kung paano siya na-express ng iba't ibang mga communities across the country. And siguro in-explore din yung political aspects of these terminologies, no? And how they can also be useful in the advocacy. So parang hindi lang tayo super reliant on these Western frameworks of SOGI. So I think dapat din natin, whenever we conduct din yung mga SOGI webinars SOGI workshops natin, we should always remind these individuals na yes, we all have SOGI, but yung mga SOGI ito essentially framework for us to better understand our identities and expressions. And there are also other, maybe indigenous identities to also explore. Dapat hindi natin kinakalimutan, especially since for some people, siguro talagang mas lapit sa kanilang karanasan ang itong mga salita na ito. Ako personally, when people ask me, how do I identify? In terms of SOGI, I simply answer, I'm gay. I think I am cisgender male or cisgender man or like non-binary. Naka-confuse ako on that aspect. No? But when people ask me like casually, hindi sa mga very academic or like formal setup, sinasabi ko na lang na bakla ako. Kasi that really encapsulates my identity. Tapos, it's also very class and racialized, di ba? So, and maganda rin na na-mention ni Victoria kanina na in her mga next steps niya sa kanyang research, gusto niya rin i-explore yung ganong klaseng dimension, di ba? Yung fields of charity and advocacy work versus yung mga day-to-day activities, kung ano yung mga language na umuusbong in this binary.
Ayun. Meron din pala akong ma-share dyan sa discussion. Kasi nakanood ako ng isang webinar din na meron presentation si Luther Aquino. Tapos pinag-usapan din nga niya yun na parang yung term na bakla, parang in a way may nagsasabi na ano siya, imprecise daw kasi 'di ba parang it's for ang bakla pwede yung gay na mukhang heterosexual, parang ganun. Yung presenting, na parang very masculine pero attracted siya to a man. Pero pwede rin yung trans woman, bakla din ang ginagamit na term. So for Western, kasi may iba-ibang term per ganon. So may mga tao nag-iisip na imprecise yung bakla. Pero parang ang inargue nung speaker ni Luther, baka parang bakit natin kino-conform sa Western lens
Yes.
yung identity? Baka for Filipinos, yung pagiging bakla, diverse siya talaga, and it encompasses these different identities, both yung mukhang masculine kind of person, and also yung trans woman. And why is that not a legitimate way of thinking about that identity? Why do we have to subscribe to yung Western So yun yung hindi sa akin yun, yung idea na yun. Napanood ko yun sa isang
I think Victoria was also pointing that out kanina, na talagang yung mga Western frameworks ay talagang rigid, diba? May parang siyang ideal types, may rigid set of categories, may set of definitions. Whereas sa Philippines, yung mga language natin, talagang very fluid, no? They cut across SOGI, and may elements of race and class. So ayun, again, hindi naman siya necessarily a bad thing. And as na-mention din kayo ni Victoria, na talagang yung mga Western frameworks, hindi naman siya copy-paste daw, diba sabi niya kanina, sa kanyang fieldwork, hindi siya copy-paste yung pag-adopt ng mga Western frameworks. And I think siguro evident yun, so based lang sa mga observations, personal observations as an advocate din, no? Di ba very rigid yung may pagka-rigid talaga yung definitions ng SOGI and mga terminologies under this framework. Pero when Filipino advocates conduct SOGI webinars, pag mini-mainstream yung SOGI, nire-recognize pa rin yung fluidity by emphasizing na at the end of the day, these are all guides. Ikaw pa rin yung makakapag-define. No, you don't have to fully subscribe to these definitions, no, kasi again guide lang siya, and hindi kailangan na matik mo all of the boxes, no. And yun nga, as lagi rin ni-remind din ng ilan na we should also try to recognize yung mga local assemblages, no. It just so happens talaga na for certain situations, like for example, for policy advocacy, talagang very useful tool lang talaga ang SOGI.
Ayun. So, si Victoria, medyo hinihintay pa rin natin siya. Nag-overheat daw yung wifi niya. So, ang gagawin ko lang, meron mga nag-post ng mga comment. Meron isa, just to share, we conducted a local study with regard to the correlation of social media exposure and acceptance of SHS learners vis-a-vis same-sex relationship. It is found that there is a moderately positive correlation among the aforementioned variables. Okay. Sige. So upon the advice of our bosses, parang matagal yung technical issue to be solved. But anyway, I think we were able to answer naman the questions that people had. And yes, pinapaplug ni Ma'am Natsi, please visit the Rainbow Crosswalk in UP Diliman. Yeah, I saw photos of that. It's so nice. So yes, please go to that and take photos of it and promote it. So thank you everyone for going to our webinar. Please watch out for our video upload of this webinar on our YouTube and for our next webinar. Thank you everyone, and thank you Brian, and thank you everyone who attended. Okay.
Happy Pride!
Happy Pride!
See you sa Pride Marches.
See you.